I'm Katie King. I'm the Director of Strategic Foresight Engagement at KnowledgeWorks.
And I'm Anne Olson. I serve as Director of State Advocacy at KnowledgeWorks.
Anne and I recently worked on a blog post together about facing uncertainty. At KnowledgeWorks, we decided to put together just some thoughts about how we look at the future of learning that we thought would be helpful for people as they're thinking about uncertainty, thinking about the future a lot more these days than they may normally do. And we wanted to dive into some of the ideas that we talked about in that blog post and talk about them a little bit further. So Anne has a background in social work, and that was one of the reasons that she and I worked on this post together, because uncertainty is a huge part of thinking about the future. It also is a huge part of the social work field. So let's dive in there, and I want to ask you, when you look at the current moment, so we're in this pandemic, schools, families, every system and individual is affected in some way by what's happening. When you look at that through your social work lens, what's standing out to you?
A lot. I think one of the interesting things about social work as a profession is that it is also a lens on the world. So you have the social work profession that focuses on any number of things, from therapeutic practices, so acting as a psychologist or a counselor would for an individual, all the way up to sort of social activism, community organizing, my job in advocacy. And so what happens is that you end up just leaving a social work training with a lens on the world. And that lens is what we call in the social work world biopsychosocial. So it is focused on the biology makeup of a person, the psychology and the psychological perspectives that they may have, or lenses that they're coming from, and then also this social lens. So recognizing that people don't live in a vacuum, people don't exist without the systems that surround them, the systems that privilege them or oppress them. And so I am coming at the pandemic from all of those perspectives, which at times, you talk about uncertainty, raises a lot of questions for me and for everyone. I think everyone is sort of by happenstance ending up in this place where we're analyzing and critiquing the world around us in a new way. And it aligns really well, for lack of a better term, with the social work lens. And in particular, a couple of things that I've just been reflecting on a lot lately are like what it means to have individual feelings using this biopsychosocial lens, have these individual feelings of anxiety, of fear, of loneliness that I am feeling right now, and recognizing that that is okay on an individual level, and everyone is experiencing that right now to a certain extent, given the environment that we're in. But then there are also social forces and societal makeups and hierarchies that exist that have to be busted through in a way that may look very different for someone else than for me. And so I'm sitting in this place where I feel the anxieties and I feel the uncertainties in one way, but my neighbor who's lost their job may be feeling it in a very different way. And so from that activist, the social side of social work, I'm coming at it from what responsibility then do I have to not only take care of myself and the individual feelings that I have in this time, but also think about what role I can play in social change to make sure that my neighbors who are much more vulnerable right now are getting the care that they need from a systems perspective to be okay.
Yeah. So there's the feelings of uncertainty, which are completely real and valid. And then there are this actual circumstances of uncertainty, not knowing where your next paycheck is going to come from, not knowing what is happening with your health or anything. So I think that's interesting to think about those two things as different sides of uncertainty.
Yes.
And what you said about handling them both and sort of seeing them at the same time, seeing them in different ways. I think is something that is really hard for a lot of people. Either we get really caught up in my feelings of uncertainty and sort of ignore that there are circumstances that are causing real material uncertainty and real hardship for people, or we say my feelings of uncertainty must be completely not valid because someone else is experiencing something much worse. So how do we hold those two things together and know that we're just kind of having to grapple with them both, that they're both real, and there's really no use or value in ignoring one over the other. So is it, and I think that's hard for us to deal with our own feelings while also thinking about what's happening in the broader world. But that's sort of what we're challenged to do right now.
Yeah, and I think that's an important distinction, the circumstances and the individual feelings, because though my feelings of anxiety and loneliness are valid in this time, I'm new to this space of feeling as uncertain about the world as I am. And that in itself is coming from a place of severe privilege. I have job security right now. I've had job security. I am able to buy a house in Denver, Colorado, which is its own kind of privilege. And I'm white. I am a middle class, upper middle class woman. And there are a lot of people in this world that have been living with uncertainty for a lot longer than just right now. And so to me, the solutions to mitigating my anxieties and perhaps feelings of uncertainty and anxiety and loneliness that others may be feeling are very different and require different leveling of solutions. And I think if we look at it from an education perspective, as sort of an easy analogy is my children, if I had them, would have easy access to internet right now and would be able to learn knowing that they would not have interruptions in their learning if they needed to rely on a computer. That is not the case for everyone. And that is a small picture of all of the different levels of uncertainties that people may or may not be feeling. And so the solution for my children might be, we need to get a laptop from the school district, that has some systems pieces to it, but for the most part is an individual solution. But for folks that don't have access to internet, don't have access to a computer, maybe don't have access for a student to be alone in a room for long enough to complete a school day online, the systemic solutions are very different. It is making sure that the school district can get them a computer. It is also making sure that there are ways for them to receive Wi-Fi hotspots. There's also, how do you get creative around making sure that there is a space for them to be? So that's a small example, but it's one that sort of shows some of those circumstantial levels of uncertainty. And though the feelings may be similar, the solutions look very different.
Yeah. And I think it can feel overwhelming to sort of grapple with all of this and hold all of it at the same time, but it seems like the least we can do, especially when we do come from these places of privilege and we're dealing with the feelings, but not as many of the actual outside difficulties and threats, that really processing through all of this and really thinking about what do I need to do to get myself in a place where I can be the person I need to be for my family, for my community, and then taking whatever action we can to address those bigger collective solutions. That to me has been one of the ways that I've been able to keep that spiral of just going through all of these thoughts in check.
Yeah, and I think that's another piece of it to me that is used a lot in therapeutic settings. There times of uncertainty, anxiety can often come when you feel overwhelmed and you are inundated with information, you're inundated with uncertainties and don't have any way to sort through that, or don't have enough ways to sort through that to where you can kind of process through things. And so finding ways to sort of control what you can right now is what are things that you can take care of for yourself? What decisions can you make? Am I going to eat pasta tonight, or am I going to eat chicken? I am definitively making chicken tonight. Even those small decisions can kind of help calm us down a little bit in times of uncertainty, which then in turn, and you address this in your blog post, can help clear our minds a little bit to then make decisions that are more in our integrity for the bigger stuff that's out there right now.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So in the post, we also talked about this sort of facade of certainty, and that our culture urges us to act as if we're certain, even when we're not. And then we have to put on this face as if, yeah, I know what's happening, and I know what to do, and I know what's going to happen next. So what are some ways that you're seeing that play out right now? Either people adopting that facade or trying to shed it?
Yeah. I think one of the ways that positively that I am seeing people address this is an inundation of doctors and social workers and community members actively making videos and being interviewed on radio programs to say we don't have to do this. So there are, I think because the time is rather unprecedented, people are still trying to create a story that's consistent for them so they can process and move on to the next thing. But enough people in the helping professions are recognizing that that is not possible right now, that they are actively creating ways to get that out to the public. And I think that's really important because it is the dominant narrative for us to sort of create a story that makes meaning of the time that we're in so that we can wrap that up with a little bow and then move on to the next thing. And we can't do that right now. And that's scary in and of itself. And I think what's a little ironic about that dominant narrative in this time is that if we try so hard to make meaning and wrap up in a little bow what's happening right now and move on to the next thing, we miss the actual meaning making of the moment we're in because we're not taking the time to reflect. But I think that we're also just going to move into the same thing that we tried to move away from right now, because the world is in such upheaval related to specifically a pandemic that if we're trying to make meaning of the pandemic this week, we're going to end up back in the same situation next week because it's still such a prominent topic of conversation and such a prominent issue in society right now across the world, really. I think too, there is the downside. Well, there are many downsides to, for me, for proclaiming certainty where you do not have any. As adult leaders who could set examples for kids, I think it comes up there. I also think that when one pretends to be certain when one is not, it creates a really dangerous environment of blame and of polarization. And I think especially in the States, we're seeing that right now. This dichotomy of I am certain we need to open the economy versus I am certain we do not. I tend to fall more in the certain we do not, but I am that culture of blame and that culture of meanness that comes with knowing that I am right and you are wrong has been building right politically in our country for a while. But I think especially right now when there is so much uncertainty, becomes particularly dangerous, almost literally dangerous physically for people in a way that perhaps it has not been for all populations in the past. But also definitely figuratively speaking, it's really dangerous for our mental health.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think a lot about, when we're thinking about the future of learning and thinking about what might come to pass, we have to get really good and comfortable with accepting new information that is different from that challenges the assumptions we may have held, and with being wrong. I mean, that when all of us are wrong, if we hold very tightly to one single view of what the future will be like, we're going to be wrong inevitably. And that's why we say we're not trying to be right. We're trying to think about a range, and we're trying to help people process and think through possibilities. And so I've really had to try to adopt that mindset in this moment, and realize that if I try to tell a coherent story about what's happening, as you put it, and try to make meaning of it, then I'm closing myself off to new information of, oh, this other thing is happening that isn't actually consistent with what I thought I understood about this moment and what I thought I understood about what might happen as a result. And so that, I think, is another really powerful reason why we have to just leave room. We're human beings, we're meaning-making creatures, so we're going to be telling ourselves stories about what's happening. It's how tightly do we hold onto those as the only thing, and how much do we use them as a way to protect ourselves against the feelings of uncertainty. I think that's where we start to get into trouble, and start making things more difficult for ourselves and for others. Because as we say, this is the way it is, well, and we make decisions based on certainty that doesn't really exist, we could very well be harming someone with those choices and with that mindset. So I think that's really important to think about. What are the stories we're telling about right now to ourselves and to others? What choices are we making? And are we leaving enough room for the fact that this is a rapidly unfolding situation that we're learning new things about every single day?
Yeah. And I think that that's what is so important about the post itself, was that, seeing the cone of plausibility and understanding that oftentimes foresight sits much farther out in the cone, farther in the future, but that has been busted to smithereens. And now what was sort of sitting out here is in the present. And so that level of uncertainty, and the feelings that accompany it, and the questions and the fear that we may have around that, are happening now instead of in the future. And so foresight tools to me become especially important to help understand, but then also to help reflect in real time, which I think is a really interesting niche that foresight has right now, because the questions that we, in convenings, for instance, that the policy team would hold, and we're talking to stakeholders about the future, they process through a lot of feelings, but they can kind of do it conceptually. Mm-hmm. But now it is not only conceptual to be taking the cone of plausibility and the reflection questions that you posted in the blog as well. It's not only that we're processing those conceptually and thinking about what could happen, it's happening real time. Yeah. And I think foresight as a field has a really powerful place right now in meaning making. A, because you all are used to living in uncertainty, and B, because the tools that you all have created in the field of foresight suddenly become very useful today too, which I think is important.
Yeah, I hope so. And that's kind of why we're having this conversation and what we're hoping to share with folks. So as you've stayed in touch, you work a lot with state leaders and groups across the country. So as you've stayed in touch with KnowledgeWorks partners and communities, what are you noticing about how they're responding to and handling the challenges and the uncertainties of this moment?
I'm noticing, especially what I would say on the ground, in schools and in districts, a lot of creativity. And I think that there are varying degrees of that, as there would be in any, system. But with the partners that I have heard about and worked with, especially at the district and school level, there is a motivation to stay resilient in this moment. I think without this facade of certainty. So, we have asked everyone within a school system to keep moving forward with a lot of question marks. And I have been continually impressed with the ways in which people have sort of said, okay, and have said, we will try a particular strategy, and if that doesn't work, we'll try something else. We haven't been able to reach 20% of our students in the district. What do we need to do differently? How will we reach them? Okay, now we are able to reach them. And so it's almost as though folks in operating in crisis mode have been able to move outside of what has typically been done, which I think long-term does beg the question, hey, what can we do differently after this is over? And we have time to strategize and reflect and think. You know, we are forcing schools and districts to rethink seat time right now. We're forcing them to rethink the relationship of facilitation between a teacher and students peer-to-peer. And we have created new opportunities for different kinds of professional development because it's been necessitated. And so long term, I think there are some policy questions that can be asked and answered about how we can approach education differently. But right now, I would never, ever wish this situation on anyone. And I am so impressed at the resilience that the partners that I have been talking with and have been seeing do this work, the resiliency that they have right now, and the ways that they have been able to move forward because they don't have a choice, but also get creative and perhaps spend a little time creating environments that that allow for some uncertainty and flexibility and adaptability because of that uncertainty, but that still are able to connect with children.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we're seeing people show up for kids and families in incredible ways against all kinds of barriers. And I think we as a society and as educators and people who support schools have a lot to learn from the ways that they're figuring out how to do that in really challenging times. Well, thanks so much for
education. It's also meals.
Yes, right.
You know, it's also making sure kiddos are safe. How do you do that now? You know, so
yeah. You know. Well, thanks for talking about this. This has been really interesting. We have a blog series right now called Futures Thinking Now. The uncertainty post was the first one, but we also look at examining assumptions, a few tools that we use in Foresight that KnowledgeWorks thinks might be helpful to people just to organize your thinking around what might be happening at this moment. And I know the policy team just put out a document as well meant to support stakeholders. If you want to just say a few words about what that is.
Yeah, so this is it's a set of guidance where we reflect on the realities for policymakers and sort of systemic education stakeholders right now, and also present some ideas for longer term opportunities. Feels a little funny to say opportunities right now, but there are things that we can be thinking about from a systems perspective right now that once a new normal emerges or once we're able to calm through some of this chaos right now, are going to be important for policymakers, especially at the state level, to think about. So that's what this guidance is. It's also available online.
Yeah, I mean, I think if there's any lesson right now, it's we have to be thinking about now and the long term. We have to be dealing with our immediate emotional needs and thinking about what we have to do for the bigger picture. So that's just what we're all being called on to do right now. So thanks for creating that to help us think through all of that.
Thanks
for the conversation.